In this next episode of Memos to the President, we're releasing a conversation I had with General H.R. McMaster, who served as President Trump's National Security Advisor, and I had the opportunity to work for him during that time as his Chief of Staff.
We're way behind on cybersecurity. We're really only defending ourselves. I can't think of any sports competition, where if you only play defense that you win, right? So we needed to really invigorate our cyber offensive capabilities as part of that defense.
We cover a range of issues related to China, North Korea, Iran, and Russia, and I hope you'll get to enjoy the conversation as much as I did interviewing him.
I'm Ylli with the Special Competitive Studies Project. Welcome back to the Memos to the President, the podcast I host with the Special Competitive Studies Project. It's truly an honor to have Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster as my guest on the podcast. I worked for him. I had the honor to work for him as his Chief of Staff at the White House. I think he's one of the best strategic minds that we have. I've learned so much working for him. You obviously can read both of his books where he provides his thoughts. The latest books, like you've written more books. But sir, it's an honor to have you back.
Hey.
It's good to have you in DC. Welcome.
Hey, Ylli, great to be with you. Hey, great to be with everybody. Thank you so much for coming. And hey, what a pleasure it was to work with you. And I've got this theory that if you encounter like a really hard problem, what you have to do is just find a Bajraktari. Just find one of either Ylli or his brother Ilber. I've served with both of them. They're fantastic people, extremely competent, but also just great patriots and great for our country. So. Hey,
thank you, sir. It's
thanks
an honor.
for being with you.
As I always say, like you're just one call away from me coming back and working for you for anything. I know you spoke at the main stage, but obviously I view your insights as really something that always are good at predicting. In 2017, you wrote the National Security Strategy, and I know you did it because I was there. And I think that document in the history will go down as probably one of the most important documents, strategic documents of our country, because you turned the corner on how you view China. Can you tell us more about why you thought at that moment in our history that was the right thing to do?
Well, we had obviously a great team working on this. Nadia Shatlow and then all of our senior directors were involved, and then we kind of got everybody involved across the government. But the reason why I think that national security strategy was very important and still kind of stands the test of time is because we recognized that we had vacated critical arenas of competition, arenas that were really important to advancing our national interests, and arenas that we vacated because of some fundamentally flawed assumptions about the nature of the post-Cold War world. And those assumptions were, first of all, that an arc of history had guaranteed the primacy of our free and open societies over closed authoritarian systems. Related to that was an assumption that, hey, great power competition, that's a relic of the past. And third, this belief that our military prowess, our technological military prowess, would guarantee our security well into the future. Remember some of the language of the 1990s, right? No peer competitor until 2020. You couldn't read any passage in any sort of defense concept without like the word dominance in there. Full spectrum dominance, dominant battle space knowledge. And what that did is it ushered in a period of complacency over optimism that then confronted some tough realities in the 2000s, right? The largest terrorist attack in the history of 9/11, murdering 3,000 Americans and taking trillions of dollars out of our economy. Then another blow, the unanticipated length and difficulty of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Instead of debating like, should we have done it? I think the invasion of Iraq, we should talk more about who the heck thought it'd be easy and why did they think it would be easy? And then we have financial crisis, right? And then we had, tossed in an opioid epidemic, big transitions in the global economy that had occurred, especially after China was welcomed into the WTO under the assumption that China would play by the rules, and then as China prospered, it would liberalize its economy and then ultimately liberalize its form of governance. Like, how'd that work out? It didn't work out. So 2017, we said, hey, we are way behind because we have vacated these arenas of competition. It's time for us to reestablish a competitive approach to foreign policy. And of course, this was consistent with what President Trump had said in 2016. And I think we helped him put in place some very significant and long overdue shifts in foreign policy.
Not only you did the national security strategy in 2017, but you also had a really first good China strategy, which I think, with Matt Pottinger and Nadia behind it. When you look now in hindsight, we had about 6 years of turning the corner on China. What is your net assessment? How well we're doing? What are the areas we have to move on?
Okay, well, I think overall we're not doing well enough, and we're starting to see some evidence of that. We had a sense back in 2017 that we were way behind. Matt Pottinger, you mentioned, is brilliant, and I mean sometimes the government puts the right guy in the right spot. My predecessor had hired him, thank goodness. He said that it's a marathon, because a lot of people say the competition with China's a marathon, but he said we're so far behind. If we don't sprint right now, we're never going to kind of catch up. And what I'm talking about, obviously, in areas related to defense and cybersecurity, we'd allowed the capacity of armed forces. This is still a problem, I think. Our forces got way too small, under the belief that our exquisite systems would allow smaller and smaller forces to have a bigger impact over wider areas. Well, hey, what did the PLA do? The People's Liberation Army, they developed countermeasures to that.
Right.
We're way behind on cybersecurity. We're really only defending ourselves. I can't think of any sports competition, where if you only play defense that you win, right? So we needed to really invigorate our cyber offensive capabilities as part of that defense. And we had some major issues economically. China had weaponized its statist mercantilist model against us in a way that allowed them to pursue what we called the 3 C's at the time: co-option, co-opt you, through promises of access to the Chinese market, maybe Chinese investment, and so forth. Cheap manufacturing in China, and then once you're in, to use that to coerce you right into supporting their foreign policy and so forth, and then to conceal all of this is the 3rd C. It's just normal business practices. And so what are we seeing now? Hey, well, we allowed our industrial base to atrophy way too much. We have allowed too many of our critical supply chains. This is all in the news now, but we were very concerned about this in 2017. Didn't do enough about it, about critical supply chains that have single points of failure associated with the Chinese Communist Party. So we're behind in, I think, military capacity and a bow wave of deferred modernization, which we have to accelerate. It's all implementation, and it is really integrating the tools of economic statecraft to compete more effectively, and to reduce our exposure to Chinese Communist Party coercion, economic coercion. And to improve our industrial capacity, manufacturing capacity, with a range of new technologies like artificial intelligence, additive manufacturing, that sort of thing.
Right. The one area, sir, that I think needs to be added is like a Chinese increasing what Admiral Paparo calls it practices around Taiwan, not exercises.
Yeah.
That we have seen an increase of them over time.
Absolutely. And so I think what's happened is, and I'm sure Admiral Paparo talked about this, is what used to be like a really big deal, like a major exercise around Taiwan, maybe we would have phone calls late at night. That's kind of the new normal now.
Yeah.
And so they've sort of desensitized, I think, us, the world, to this ramping up of aggression. But of course, what's accompanying that is a lot of political subversion, and that effort to co-opt elites, a really major effort to reduce Taiwan's will to defend themselves. They do that through some of their kind of useful idiots in the KMT party in particular, but really what they want to do is to convince the Taiwanese people they have no other option but to accommodate with the party. Well, how'd that go for Hong Kong? Not well, right? So my faith is in the Taiwanese people to have learned vicariously through the experience of Taiwan, and of course the Taiwanese leadership understands the nature of the CCP, and so I think what we have to do is really help the Taiwanese bolster their will, make themselves as defensible as possible, with addressing this backlog of arms
sales,
manufacturing sales, which is related to the other issue of industrial capacity, right? I mean, I think there are $22 billion of backlogged weapons sales to Taiwan.
Sticking with the Asia continent, North Korea, I know when you were at the White House, that was one of the like every other night issue that you had to deal with.
Only on holidays. It was like
Only
every
on
holiday.
holiday.
I mean, really, Kim Jong-un. I mean, can't I just enjoy like the 4th of July? No.
So how do you view the situation right now in North Korea?
Yeah, I think it's extremely dangerous. And one of the reasons why it's not being talked about is, again, this is a way that North Korea's kind of desensitized us with a lot of these sort of provocations. And of course, during the Biden administration, and even in the Trump administration before that, you had a dissipation of what had been our policy, President Trump's policy, of maximum pressure on Kim Jong-un to test the thesis that Kim Jong-un could be convinced that he was safer without the weapons, his regime was, than with the weapons. We never were able to follow through on that, I think because the pressure naturally dissipated with the Singapore summit, then the Hanoi summit, and then we kind of just moved on to other things. And so Kim Jong-un, since that time during the Biden administration, has engaged in unprecedented aggression, of course, against the South, coercion against the South, but also like tearing down the unification arch, rewriting parts of the Constitution, saying, hey, South Korea is our only enemy. But then, most of all, supporting Russia with maybe $40 billion worth of assistance in terms of manpower, 8 million rounds of artillery and missiles and so forth, and North Korean troops fighting on European soil. So I think this is a really significant threat. It demands a much greater response in terms of trying to reimpose maximum pressure, maybe having to do that from the outside in, because it's Russia has doubled down on support for North Korea in return for the support it got, and that's technical assistance for its conventional weapons programs, its missiles, and its nuclear program, I believe.
Not moving away, a little bit focused on South Korea. They just had election. I liked your Substack entry.
Thanks.
You just started that Substack, so it's a really good daily.
Thanks for plugging it. It's called History We Don't Know.
Please like and subscribe.
Yeah. So I think we're in for a rough ride based on the outcome of the South Korean elections. And that's because of the ideology of the far left party there and its leader, who has called U.S. forces there an occupation force, who has said nice things about China, and as President Trump would say, not so nice things about the United States, right? So hey, I think that's a problem, because I think what that government, that far left government will try to do is try to put the United States in between it and the North Korea problem. That's not going to work with President Trump. And what that could do is reinforce President Trump's predilection toward retrenchment. He often would say, like, hey, South Korea is a wealthy country, they can defend themselves. But of course, it redounds to our benefit in so many ways to have that presence on the peninsula. Look at how much shipping goes between Japan and South Korea, the dilemmas that creates for this axis of aggressors, particularly the two revanchist powers on the Eurasian landmass of China and Russia. It's important to remember Russia is also kind of a Pacific power, and our presence on the peninsula and in Japan is really important to deterring both Russian and Chinese as well as North Korean aggression. So this isn't the first time, and we should learn the idea of this column, as you learn from history, where you had a U.S. government in place that had an incompatible sort of approach to North Korea as the South Korean government. This happened during George W. Bush's time with, remember, the Sunshine Policy. It happened during President Trump's time with the Moonshine Policy with President Moon, and now we're getting ready for another round. So there has to be a lot of diplomatic focus on coming up with maybe some first principles about the threats in the region and how we can work together. And I'm really worried about the South Korea-Japan relationship, because one of the ways that this far left party in South Korea panders to its most strident supporters is by bashing Japan. So there's a lot of diplomatic work to do. Something else for Secretary Rubio to do, because I don't think he has very much on his plate right now. So maybe he can get after that pretty quickly.
Switching to Middle East, sir, I mean, you served there a lot during your career. There's a lot going on. You have the Israel-Palestine situation. You have Houthis, Yemen, not to mention the Abraham Accords moving 2 steps forward, 1 step backward every day. Can you give us an overall assessment of how you view the situation in the Middle East today?
Yeah, okay, so I think there's a tremendous opportunity in the Middle East. I think President Trump alluded to some of this during his visit to Riyadh and his speeches there and in the region broadly. But, I think what has happened is Israel didn't take our advice, thank goodness, because the advice that we were giving Israel is don't escalate, right? And there was this mantra of de-escalation. And what that did, from the Iranian perspective, is give the theocratic dictatorship in Iran license to escalate on its own terms with impunity. So what did Israel do? Israel recognizes that it has to destroy Hamas. Now, it's terrible in terms of the suffering of the Palestinian people and how they're caught in this crossfire, deliberately placed there by Hamas. But people who talk about a resolution of the conflict in Gaza, and then in the next sentence talk about maybe progress toward a two-state solution, what they skip over is how destroying Hamas is a precondition for any kind of progress, because Hamas in its charter is dedicated to destroy Israel and killing all the Jews. That doesn't sound like they're signing up, for a two-state solution to me. So it's important, I think, to support Israel's efforts to destroy Hamas. And then what we really need, and again, this is another big diplomatic effort, but we've got to put as much pressure, create as many incentives as we can for the formation of some kind of international peace enforcement force that can create space for an alternative political order to emerge in Gaza that is not Hamas, right? And of course, that peace enforcement force has to have the authority to fight, because if you say today, hey, I'll be the mayor of Gaza, you're gonna get a bullet in the head. So we're back to kind of the importance of consolidating gains to get the political outcomes, the need to destroy Hamas, which I think is feasible. I wish that we could convince the Egyptians to open up that border to Gaza, create a humanitarian facility in the Sinai, get people out of harm's way, screen them on the way out, and then have them return as reconstruction begins. That would be helpful. So that's one part of a very complicated problem set. What Israel then did is they disregarded the advice, again, to take the win, to not strike back against Iran, and then they had the very effective operations against Hezbollah, decapitating their leadership, decimating their ranks. That had a ripple effect into Syria, because guess what? Assad was reliant on Hezbollah and the Iranian proxy army. That collapsed. Then Russia's and Iran's situation collapses in Syria. There's a tremendous opportunity for that. Do I think Shah has changed, the leader of Syria? No, I don't think so. So hopefully what we're doing is going in with a clear eye to incentivize a pluralistic government and a formation of a government and a democratic process consistent with the UN resolution that's been in place for a long time that lays out a pretty good process. So Syria should be a big focus. But overall, the problems run back to Iran and Iran's stoking, as you already alluded to, of these sectarian civil wars that allow them to create proxies in the region by portraying themselves as protectors of the Shia communities and elements. And then, of course, that creates kind of beleaguerment among Sunni communities. You see this in Iraq. You see this in Yemen, for sure. This was the Hezbollah model, basically, right? Applied to the region. Iran is in a profound position of weakness, I believe, at this moment. I think the right time now is to increase that pressure on Iran. You see the rolling blackouts in Iran, the trucking strike, which wasn't really covered very much. Keep that pressure on the Iranian regime, because that's the only way you're going to get to any kind of either acceptable agreement. But I think there is a possibility, and again, it's easy to kind of overstate these possibilities given the mechanisms of authoritarian state control and how hard they are to break. But there is the chance that the Iranian government could change fundamentally into a government that ceases its permanent hostility to the United States, Israel, and its Arab neighbors. That's ultimately what you've got to shoot for, right? And I don't think we can do that. The Iranian people have to do that. But I think we should evaluate what we're doing, sanctions relief or no sanctions relief, right? Nuclear deal or not nuclear deal, based on that overall long-term objective. And if you go back to President's speech in October of 2017, President Trump's speech on Iran, where he laid out that strategy, everybody just focused on the JCPOA part of the decision in that speech, but that speech laid out a comprehensive approach to Iran, which I think is still valid today.
Sir, I think we covered 3 out of 4 axes of disruptors, as we call them. Let's cover Russia.
Yeah.
We saw an incredible attack by Ukrainian over the weekends.
Yeah.
You spoke last year about Russia and Ukraine here on stage.
Yeah.
What is your current assessment of the situation?
Yeah, I think, again, I mean, Russia is in a position of profound weakness as well. I don't believe the casualties they're taking are sustainable. And a lot of people talk about how tough the Russian people are culturally, how much pain they can endure. But 50,000 casualties a month, going over the 1 million casualty figure in the last few weeks, most estimates agree that that's the case. I don't think it's sustainable. They're having a really hard time generating manpower, and their economy is in really desperate straits. I mean, Putin's sitting on piles of cash he can't convert. He's spending about 50% of federal spending on defense. That's not sustainable. He's got a labor shortage. He's importing essentially slave labor from Africa now as well in some of these drone factories and other places. And so I think now's the time to kind of ratchet up the pressure as oil prices are coming down, putting more financial pressure on him. Because I believe, Putin will not stop in Ukraine until he is stopped. until he concludes that he's losing. That's the only time where you're going to get like a ceasefire and any kind of progress toward a settlement that's acceptable to the Ukrainians. What Putin was doing, because, Putin's played so many world leaders, right? I mean, President Trump is not the first world leader to be the object of a Putin influence campaign, right? The KGB operative. I mean, think about how long Chancellor Merkel was convinced, that she was going to be the Putin whisperer, that he would come in from the cold if only they bought Russian gas. I mean, how did that work out, right? And I think President George W. Bush and President Obama with the reset policy. President Biden went to Geneva, laid out all his red lines, which meant a green light to Putin for everything else, right? So I think you have to recognize what Putin wanted from President Trump is President Trump to agree to a ceasefire arrangement and maybe some sort of an ultimate settlement that was unacceptable to the Ukrainians, and then use that to put more pressure on the Ukrainians to cut off aid to the Ukrainians. And what I'm hoping is President Trump is going to now back in because of now Putin's really obvious intransigence is going to back in to an approach of maximum pressure on Putin and sustained support for Ukraine, maybe in the form of a long-term low-interest loan. I mean, I think that is the right thing to do. President Trump also often says peace through strength, and I think this is where, peace through strength is really important. Then what happens, I think, is we restore a lot of the trust that has been eroded between the U.S. and Europe. And what you get is a Europe that now recognizes it's got to shoulder more of its defense responsibilities, is investing more in defense. That trust is restored, and we emerge even stronger from the turbulence of the last few months.
You covered the allies and partners, which was my next question. So a little bit of assessment of our allies and partners in Europe. I know you had an incredible relationship with late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in Japan.
Yeah.
So how do you view overall the status of our allies and partners' relationship with the United States?
Our allies are stepping up, and I think this is an area where President Trump can take a lot of credit, maybe not as much credit as he wants, or all of it, but I mean, a lot of credit. And of course, he's not the only president to have said this, others have said it before President Trump's Trump 45 administration, but he really got some momentum going behind at least meeting the Wales pledge of 2%. Now, of course, the talk is 3%, maybe 5%. And you see countries stepping up who are, I think, becoming kind of the new conscience of Europe. These are Eastern Europeans, the Poles, the Baltic states, and now the newest members among them in the Nordic states, especially Finland and Sweden. I mean, these are serious militaries who have joined NATO, bring a whole range of tremendous capabilities. And what you have is this coming on the back end of the tour of duty of, I think, maybe one of the most talented officers I've ever known, Chris Cavoli, the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, who developed a number of contingency plans and drew from those plans the requirements that were necessary for military capabilities and capacity and infrastructure.
Right.
With the German election and Europe's biggest economy now pledging to increase the percentage of GDP equivalent in defense, that's a huge deal, and so I think the trends are in a positive direction. The variable that concerns me is U.S. will to continue to support Ukraine and the implications of that on Europe, because it's important to understand, what does Putin want? Putin wants a servile relationship with Ukraine. He wants to just extinguish Ukrainian sovereignty in this drive to kind of reestablish the Russian Empire. What else does he want? He wants to break NATO apart, right? We shouldn't be helping him do that. And I think as someone said before about NATO, if you want an argument for why NATO is important, just look at how desperate Putin is to break it apart. That's a good indicator.
Right. So another thing that goes little noticed is in your 2017 national security strategy, you talk about AI.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is pre-Chat GPT era, AI becoming a mainstream. How do you think this situation now has changed since then?
Well, I mean, what you've seen with the release of LLMs and now maybe even more and more release of open weights models that I think this is out in the public domain, that a big U.S. company is about to release one. I think what you see now is we're in a very intense competition with the Chinese Communist Party. It's one that I am optimistic about. I'm optimistic about our ability to keep our technological advantage. We have to improve on countering industrial espionage, for sure. And we have to improve a human capital strategy, right? I think we should make it easier for graduates in computer science, to get that H-1B visa and stay on our team, than going somewhere else. But I think what we really need to do is to be able to adopt and employ the models much more quickly. And so I know there are concerns about that,
Right.
but I think whatever the process is, it's got to be fast,
Right.
because the advantage is going to go to the swift, the race to the swift
Right.
in this case, and we have to become much more agile, not only at developing these models and capabilities, but adapting them
Right. My last question, sir, because we're getting there.
or adopting them, I should
Yeah.
say.
If you were in the seat of the National Security Advisor today, your NSS from 17 had 4 pillars.
Yeah.
Would you do it again along those lines? How and what has changed in the meantime
Yeah.
to reflect today's reality?
Yeah, I would, because I think the pillars represented, and this is Dr. Shadlow's,
Right. I mean,
construct,
big
which I think
fans of
works.
Nadia,
Yeah. And what we did is we looked at all the previous national security strategies, and we concluded that the vast majority of them were aspirational. It's describing the world as maybe we would like an idealized world to be. But what we want to do is to take a hard look at the nature of geostrategic competitions today, and then identify the key actions that we had to take to maintain our competitive advantages, right? And to ensure that that our free and open societies, our democratic form of governance, and our free market economies were in positions of maximum advantage over competitors. And so those pillars of peace through strength, I still believe that's the case, right? We've seen what the alternative looks like.
And even the chairman of the Joint Chiefs said that today in his opening remarks.
Absolutely, and he's a fantastic leader too. I think we're very fortunate to have him in that job. And then and then of course we want to promote American prosperity, right? I mean, who doesn't want a better life for their kids and grandkids? I mean, I do, right? So we want to promote prosperity. The third thing we wanted to do was extend American influence. And this again gets to sort of the other forms of competition in our world. And then we wanted to absolutely grow some of our competitive advantages in the area of technology and everything as well. So I think that I would still organize it that way. The competitions have evolved. I think we're in a much more dangerous world because of the coalescing of this axis of aggressors. I think I would recommend today some broader approaches to the axis of aggressors, which might be a bit contrary to the conventional wisdom. Because remember, everybody wants to split Russia away from China, right? The reverse Nixon or reverse Kissinger you'll hear and everything. I think that's a fool's errand, because they've expressed their undying love for one another, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, right? I mean, how many times have they met? I mean, they cook together, and they're BFFs, So don't do that. How about gluing them together? Not only because they deserve each other, but when we pretend that they're separate from one another, we give them space to run with, right? I mean, how about secondary sanctions on Chinese banks that are facilitating financial flows to Russia? How about moving the entities list of Chinese companies that are helping Russia with their onslaught on Ukraine with electronics and hardware onto a Treasury sanctions list? How about just ramping up the pressure in recognition that the best approach for us is to glue them together and hang their mutual problems around their necks like lodestones, right? Not for their people, to drag their people down, but to compete against these governments that are I think already in many ways at war with us.
Last question. You're at Stanford now, enjoying academic life. Anything?
Trying not to go soft in California, man. It's hard. It's hard not to.
Anything interesting you read recently? I know you read a lot of books. Something that really sparked your curiosity.
Okay. All right. So I mean, this is going to be strange saying this, but I'm reading the second volume of Rick Atkinson's trilogy on the Revolution.
Okay.
And it's fantastic. I mean, so if you haven't read it, read the first volume, The British Are Coming. June 14th coming up here, 250th anniversary of
Army.
The Army, right? And it's also Flag Day. It's also President's birthday. I think understanding really, how near run a thing the revolution was, and how these courageous, these courageous men and women who fought for our independence, it gave us something that is worth preserving. So that's what I'm reading at the moment. Got a number of other books going at the same time, but I'm really enjoying that one.
Sir, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your service. It was an honor to work for you.
Thanks,
Please
man.
join me in the round of applause.
Thanks. Thanks, brother.